The wind tugged at the rusted barbed wire strung along the perimeter of the POW camp in northern France. It was early 1945, and spring had not yet dared to show its face. Rows of gray-cloaked officers stood in silence as the distant drone of engines thickened in the sky. The sound grew like a rising tide, low and resonant, until it seemed to pass through the bones of every man listening. And then they saw them. Dozens, no, hundreds of bombers. They glinted like fish scales under the pale sun, layered in perfect formation from horizon to horizon. It was not the first time the prisoners had seen this display, but it never failed to silence them. One colonel, a veteran of Poland in the Eastern Front, exhaled sharply and muttered under his breath, "They fall from the sky like rain." A few younger men crossed themselves. Others just stared, their lips tight, their hands clenching woolen coats that no longer felt like a uniform but like shackles. Somewhere, someone whispered that these machines came not from some hidden stockpile of the Allied command, but from factories, new ones, built just for this purpose. That was the moment it began to settle in. The war was lost, not because their tanks had faltered or their doctrines failed, but because somewhere across an ocean, a nation had done the unthinkable. It had industrialized victory. Back in 1942, inside the marble corridors of the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, Minister of Armaments Albert Speer stood before Hitler with a plan. Germany would match the Allies, tank for tank, plane for plane. The Führer, obsessed with steel and strength, nodded gravely. He believed deeply in the precision of German engineering, in the prowess of his labor battalions, in the superiority of centralized control. The Reich would outlast because it was ordered, disciplined, exact. But Speer didn't yet understand what he was up against. Because while Nazi Germany was trying to squeeze more tanks out of a crushed economy and slave labor, America had turned its mind to something else entirely. Not more guns, not more planes, but more factories. In Washington, D.C., a different kind of war council was unfolding. There were no salutes, no swastikas, no demagogues pounding fists. Just engineers, economists, and bureaucrats in rolled-up sleeves. At the head of this effort stood men like Henry J. Kaiser and William Knudsen. Not generals, but builders. Kaiser, who once built dams, now turned his mind to Liberty ships. Knudsen, a former GM executive, was brought into Roosevelt's circle not to shoot bullets, but to multiply them. Their philosophy was starkly different from the German approach. Where Hitler centralized and controlled, America delegated and scaled. Where Germany tried to perfect each weapon, America asked, "How fast can we build 10,000 of them?" The American way wasn't elegant. It was brutal in its volume. It didn't worship design. It worshipped throughput. By mid-1942, entire cities began to change shape. Detroit, already the beating heart of the automotive industry, became something more, a forge. Its highways turned into convoys. Its factories never slept. Trains arrived hourly carrying steel, copper, aluminum, and coal, all bound for destinations like Willow Run, where B-24 Liberators would soon begin to roll off the line. In contrast, the German war machine began to resemble a wounded animal. Yes, they had the V-2 rocket. They had the Tiger tank. They had Messerschmitts and Panthers and sleek submarines that haunted the Atlantic. But each weapon was a masterpiece. And that was the problem. A Tiger tank was a marvel. But it took far too long to make. The V-2 was the future. But it cost so much and hit so little. Germany was building the sharpest knife in a gunfight. America? America brought an ocean of fire. By the winter of 1943, The psychological effects of American production were beginning to ripple through the upper ranks of the Wehrmacht. Reports came in not just of heavy bombing, but of how the Allies replaced their losses before the bomb casings cooled. Factories that should have taken a decade to build were fully operational in months. Women and teenagers operated machines with stunning efficiency. Civilians who had never held a rifle now produced more bullets than Germany could fire. And worse, the enemy was invisible. The German officers in the field could not fathom who built all this. There was no Hitler figure rallying the Americans, no singular command like Speer or Göring directing every detail. Yet it worked. It worked better than anything the Reich had imagined. Inside camps like Stalag Luft through, captured pilots would talk about the size of the airfields in Kansas. "We park our bombers side by side, nose to tail," one prisoner said, "and still run out of room." For the German officers, this was not just data. It was disillusionment. They had been trained to believe in the superiority of the fatherland, in its discipline, its resolve, its technical excellence. But now, behind fences, they began to suspect a harder truth, that freedom, unrestrained, chaotic, and impossibly fast, was more powerful than control. The final blow came not from a bomb, but from a report. In January 1945, intercepted German communications confirmed what many already feared. The Allies had passed the point of no return. Their production was self-sustaining, their logistics system was global, and their will, unlike the Reich's, had not cracked under Allied losses. One major in captivity put it best. "We believed we were fighting men, but we were fighting machines." No, not machines. A machine implies something rigid, something predictable. What the Germans faced was a society that could adapt overnight, that could build an empire of assembly lines without ever calling it one. What they saw in those skies, those endless formations of bombers, was not just American power. It was American belief, the belief that the individual, when trusted and empowered, could do more than the state ever dreamed. As the formations vanished over the horizon and silence returned to the camp, the German officers turned away from the fence. Their war, they now knew, was no longer winnable. Not in the mud, not in the air, not in the factories, and not in the heart. In the early mornings at Willow Run, the Michigan air carried the smell of oil, steel, and cigarette smoke. Not the perfume of war zones, but of something just as potent, the scent of momentum. As the sun crested over the frost-rimmed rooftops of the bomber plant, a siren wailed, not a warning, but a beginning. Shift change. Thousands of workers poured through the gates. They came in coats still dusted with snow. Farmhands from Iowa, housewives from Cleveland, former soda jerks, janitors, machinists, students. They came because someone had told them, "Your country needs you." But not to fight, to build. By 1943, the United States wasn't just fighting a war, it was forging one. And nowhere was that more visible, more unbelievable than here. At the place Henry Ford promised could roll out one heavy bomber every hour. A B-24 Liberator, assembled not by artisans or military engineers, but by ordinary hands trained to extraordinary rhythm. Willow Run wasn't just a factory. It was a living machine, a place where steel found purpose, where workers found pride, and where the idea of industrial warfare was reborn. Stretching nearly a mile from one end to the other, the plant seemed less like a building and more like a force of nature. It was an artery of aluminum and ambition. Conveyors ran in ceaseless motion, overhead cranes danced between fuselage sections, and rivet guns snapped like drumbeats under the glare of sodium lamps. Along the spine of the line, wings took shape. Landing gear clamped into place, engines growled through their first coughs of fire. Every 55 minutes, the back doors of Willow Run opened to the roar of a new bomber's engines. The idea behind this miracle wasn't new. Henry Ford had revolutionized American manufacturing decades earlier with the Model T. But the stakes now were far greater than profit or convenience. This wasn't about cars. This was about liberty. Liberty built not in marble halls, but in the calloused hands of factory crews who learned to do, unflinchingly, what had to be done. Inside, the noise was thunderous. On the floor, women in denim coveralls hunched over tail fins with torque wrenches, their hair tucked beneath scarves like the now iconic Rosie the Riveter. Men guided panels into place, wiped oil from their faces, shouted over steam lines and signal bells. They worked under quotas, yes. But more than that, they worked under a sense of sacred duty. One worker described it as church with sparks. You didn't have to believe in God, he said, but you believed that if you missed your bolt, someone's son might not come home. And so the line moved, hour after hour, day after day. Not perfectly, not quietly, but endlessly. Cigarette breaks were timed with rail deliveries. When aluminum sheets arrived, 5 men were already waiting to hoist them into line. When landing gear units clattered down from the second floor, someone below was ready with a wrench before the crate touched concrete. It wasn't a symphony. It was jazz, American jazz, improvised, raw, syncopated, and utterly relentless. What astonished German officers most wasn't just the number of planes. It was who made them. In post-war interrogations, one Wehrmacht logistics officer asked, "Are you telling me housewives built this?" He'd seen photographs of Willow Run, of women leaning over blueprints, teenagers manning drill presses, black workers guiding tail sections into place under banners that read, "Loose lips sink ships." It contradicted everything he'd been taught. In the Reich, production was a sacred duty reserved for the obedient, the tested, the trained. Factories were shrines of order. Workers were to be directed, not empowered. But here, the American war machine wasn't a monolith. It was a mosaic. Ford Motor Company ran Willow Run, but it was supported by subcontractors from across the nation. Fuselage sections arrived from Pennsylvania, tires from Akron, plexiglass from California. Steel was rolled in Illinois. Copper was wired in Missouri. Every state, every county in some cases, touched these bombers before they flew. It was a republic of rivets, a democracy of destruction. The contrast grew starker with every passing month. In 1943, Germany was already tightening belts. Bombing raids had damaged key industrial nodes. Supply chains were fraying. Synthetic fuel plants were overworked. Labor shortages grew dire. And yet German leadership doubled down on centralization, on control, on obsessive perfectionism. Speer's office pushed for rationalization, but it was too late. The Reich's factories couldn't scale fast enough. And as their bombs shrank in number, America's multiplied. Captured German officers couldn't comprehend how the U.S. had replaced every aircraft lost in combat, sometimes within the same month. To them, it was black magic. But it wasn't magic. It was management, delegation, trust. An American worker didn't need to know the whole war plan, just his role in it. There was poetry, too, in the monotony, in the way a mother from Ohio learned to weld bomb racks. in the way a college dropout spent 12 hours a day pressing steel flaps. These weren't celebrated heroes. Their names weren't etched on medals, but they made victory possible, one screw, one bolt, one engine at a time. By the end of 1944, Willow Run was averaging 14 liberators a day, over 8,600 in total. To a passing eye, the B-24 was just a machine. But to those who built it, it was a promise that American sons in the air would have the best wings beneath them, that the skies above Europe would never again be safe for tyranny, and that somewhere, on some front line, an Allied soldier would look up and know someone far away had not forgotten them. It's hard to quantify what Willow Run meant. Yes, it was a factory. But it was also a signal to the world that democracy could be fast, that liberty could be efficient, that a nation of free people, when given the tools and the trust, could outbuild an empire. The workers inside didn't wear uniforms, but they fought. And every hour, as another bomber rolled out into the Michigan snow, engines growling, propellers spinning, the quiet voice of resistance grew louder. Not all soldiers carry rifles. Some carry rivet guns. By the summer of 1944, the skies over Europe were no longer just a battleground. They were a canvas of dominance. Black dots speckled the horizon each morning, growing larger and louder with every beat of the propellers. These were not isolated missions, not lightning raids, not desperate gambles. These were waves, coordinated, predictable, relentless, and they came every day. From the shattered remains of the Luftwaffe's forward bases, German spotters looked upward with binoculars that once brimmed with confidence. Now, they shook in disbelief. Some formations stretched over 100 miles. B-17, flying fortresses. B-24, liberators. P-51 Mustangs dancing along the edges like wolves circling the herd. Squadrons layered at different altitudes, staggered like chess pieces across the sky. One wave dropped bombs. Another circled to cover the retreat. Another already on approach. There was no longer a lull. There was no longer a pause. The Allies had reached a point that the Reich could not understand, let alone match. Not just air superiority, but industrial supremacy. In 1944 alone, the United States produced nearly 100,000 aircraft. That's more planes in 1 year than Nazi Germany built in the entire war. Factories across America were no longer measured by their blueprints or workforce, but by output per hour. A B-17 every 63 minutes. A P-47 Thunderbolt every 30. Fighters were packed in wooden crates, shipped across oceans, and reassembled on forward airfields in Britain and Italy. The numbers became almost absurd, and that was the point. German war planners, trained in efficiency and elegance, had built machines that were marvels. Messerschmitt Bf-109s, the Focke-Wulf FW-190s, and later the jet-powered Me-262. These were fast, agile, and deadly. But there were never enough, not even close. Because behind every Allied plane shot down came 5 more. And it wasn't just the planes, it was everything. American factories produced over 600,000 trucks for military use. That number dwarfed the entire Axis vehicle output. German soldiers, fighting in mud, often relied on horses to pull artillery. Meanwhile, the Americans had motorized their entire war. The U.S. built over 88,000 tanks, nearly 2.5 million machine guns, and over 41 billion rounds of ammunition. German generals who once sneered at American soldiers as soft were now being surrounded not just by infantry, but by a system. A grid, a conveyor belt of destruction. Liberty ships were being launched in less than 5 days. Entire floating warehouses stocked with fuel, ammunition, medical supplies, and spare parts. every piece of it built with the same cold math. Quantity wins wars. And it did. On the Eastern Front, Hitler had gambled that the brutality of winter and the depth of Russian resolve would slow the Red Army. On the Western Front, he gambled that the Atlantic Wall and the Luftwaffe would keep the Americans at bay. He lost both bets, because the Americans didn't just bring firepower, they brought replacements. They didn't just patch up tanks, they delivered new ones from across an ocean. While German factories were being bombed to rubble, American production increased. While the Third Reich rationed fuel, the Allies flooded Normandy with high-octane barrels marked for combat use only. By the end of 1944, American soldiers joked that their greatest weapon wasn't the M1 Garand. It was the logistics truck. And they weren't wrong. On the ground, German infantry divisions were being worn down, not by brilliant tactics, but by attrition. Where once they could rotate units and recover, now they bled continuously. One major wrote bitterly in a field report, "It is not that the Americans fight better. It is that they do not run out." In the air, the Luftwaffe's best were dead or grounded. The few German pilots who managed to survive more than 100 sorties were now facing American teenagers with just a few months of training, but whose Mustangs came with replacement parts, endless fuel, and backup squadrons. One German ace, once a hero in the Reich, admitted in his diary, "I shoot one down. Another replaces him. I land. He flies again. How do you fight that?" You don't. You endure. You hope the tide turns. And then, slowly, you realize it never will. In early 1945, American generals received an intelligence transcript from a prisoner camp near Remagen. A captured German general had been shown an aerial photo. Hundreds of bombers parked in a Kansas airfield, all in reserve. Not in battle, not even in transit, just waiting. He stared for a long time, then turned and asked, "How can a people make so many and still sing jazz?" It was a question born not of sarcasm, but of genuine disbelief. Because what unnerved the German officer corps more than the machinery was the culture that created it. To them, war was supposed to be total, a national obsession, a sacrifice. The German people had been indoctrinated to give everything. Children sent to flak towers, women pressed into production camps, propaganda screamed day and night. But the Americans, they danced, they smoked cigarettes and drank Coca-Cola. They listened to swing. They painted pin-up girls on the sides of bombers. They read comic books and wrote home about baseball scores. And somehow, they still outproduced the Reich tenfold. That was the part the Nazis couldn't comprehend. How could a nation so free, so fragmented, so undisciplined, be this unstoppable? They didn't understand that it was precisely because of that freedom. A decentralized nation had become a centralized force of will, not by mandate, but by belief. Each factory, each farm, each freight car was powered not by fear, but by purpose. And that purpose had a number behind it, a number the Reich couldn't match. In the end, no doctrine could stop the steel tide. No Tiger tank, no jet fighter, no fortress bunker could hold back the raw momentum of a nation that had industrialized not just war, but victory itself. The numbers weren't abstract anymore. They were shadows over the fatherland. They were wings over Berlin. They were boots on German soil. And to the men who once laughed at American softness, there was now only silence. The photos were laid out like tarot cards across the interrogation table. Glossy recon prints still smelling faintly of chemicals. A low hum from the overhead lights filled the silence, as 3 German officers stood behind the chairs, arms crossed, boots still caked in Ardennes frost. A young American intelligence officer, just 25, educated at Yale, now wearing a pressed uniform and the fatigue of too many sleepless nights, gestured to the images without saying a word. Each frame showed a different field, not a battlefield, not a depot, but an airfield. The first, a sea of B-24 Liberators, wings overlapping like fallen dominoes across a Kansas horizon. The second, P-51 Mustangs lined up in endless rows, tails up, engines dormant. The third, overhead surveillance of an assembly plant yard with hundreds of new aircraft, parked in perfect symmetry. The Germans leaned in. They didn't speak. The Luftwaffe colonel, once a flight group commander in France, blinked hard and whispered something in a voice the interpreter didn't catch. The American finally spoke. These aren't in Europe. None of them. These are reserve fields. Stateside. They're waiting. The silence that followed wasn't confusion. It was surrender. Intellectual. Spiritual. The kind that comes not after a battle, but after understanding the sheer weight of what's coming next. It was late 1944. The Wehrmacht had just launched its final, desperate counteroffensive. A brutal winter gamble now known as the Battle of the Bulge. Fueled by stolen fuel, surprise, and fanaticism, German tanks had punched through the Ardennes in a bid to break Allied morale and drive a wedge between their armies. And for a moment, it worked. American units were pushed back. Supplies were stretched thin. Fog blanketed the skies, grounding Allied air power just long enough to sow panic. In places like Bastogne, the fighting was desperate, primal, bayonets and bullets in the snow. But the moment the skies cleared, it was over. American bombers returned in squadrons so vast they had to stagger takeoffs over hours. Cargo planes dropped supplies to surrounded divisions. Fighter bombers danced like hornets over the icy forests, turning German columns into smoldering metal graves. The German High Command had wagered its last reserves. The Americans answered with their surplus. Back in prisoner camps scattered across the Allied lines, in Belgium, in France, in England, something changed. Interrogators reported a shift in tone. The usual arrogance from SS officers faded. The confident critiques from Luftwaffe pilots evaporated. And not because they had been beaten in the air or on the ground. They were used to that. No. What silenced them were the photographs. Aerial images of airfields in Texas and Nebraska filled with hundreds of bombers. Not battle-worn, not patched with urgency, but pristine. Silent, lined up in storage. One Luftwaffe captain studied the images for almost an hour before finally saying simply, "We have nothing left, and you have not yet begun to use everything you have." The realization came not like an explosion, but like a tide, a creeping awareness. That the Reich had not lost to a superior army or even to strategic mistakes, but to a system so massive, so coordinated, so infinitely replenishable, that resistance was now just a delay. They'd lost not in Berlin or Normandy or the Ardennes. They'd lost the moment America learned how to build war faster than Germany could fight it. By now, German soldiers returning from the front no longer bragged in train cars. They stared out of windows at fields turned to mud, at cities turned to dust. Factories bombed flat, rail lines twisted by Allied ordnance, supply chains so crippled that horses now pulled panzer crews. One Wehrmacht colonel, captured outside of Aachen, told his interrogator, "I believed we were defending Germany, but now I know. We are defending rubble." The psychological collapse was spreading faster than the military one. Reports from American intelligence units documented the shift. German officers were requesting better treatment for their men. Some even asked how the U.S. planned to rebuild Germany after the war. The tone was no longer fanatical. It was pragmatic and hauntingly quiet. In January 1945, a group of surrendered officers at a British-controlled camp were shown footage of the Ford Willow Run bomber plant in action. The projector clicked in darkness. They watched women in overalls guiding bombers through final checks, assembly lines of men welding, bolting, calibrating engines with the same rhythm used for cars, cranes hoisting tail sections like toy parts into place. The film ended. A former logistics officer stood up and asked, "How many of these plants do you have?" The British interpreter shrugged. Enough. The German sat down. No further questions. By March, the surrender of the mind was complete. In one final interrogation, a captured SS major, tall, educated, fluent in English, turned to his American counterpart and said, "You people, you don't even understand what you've done." The American frowned. "What do you mean?" The major tapped his fingers against the table, slowly. "You took a free people and turned them into a machine. And somehow, they still laugh. They still write love letters. They still dance. That is terrifying." Not all losses are marked by flags falling or capitals captured. Some are felt in the gut, in the cold knowledge that the momentum has shifted so fully that no amount of courage, no final order, no brilliant tactic can change the outcome. That's what the Germans began to feel in late 1944. That the war was no longer being lost, it had already been lost. And now they were just watching it happen in slow motion. In the final frames of a film reel discovered after the war, a German officer is seen staring at a captured P-51 Mustang. He walks around it slowly, hand on the fuselage, tracing its American markings. The engine is still warm. The cockpit still smells of oil and leather and adrenaline. He steps back, and he smiles, not in joy, but in resignation. He salutes it once, then turns away. It didn't end with a bang. Not for the men who built it. At 7:59 a.m. on June 28, 1945, the final B-24 Liberator rolled off the line at Willow Run. The floor crew stood in silence. Tools rested on benches. The rivet guns, for once, were quiet. Someone passed around a coffee thermos. Someone else wiped their hands on an oily rag, unsure whether to cheer or cry. For nearly 4 years, they had built these machines like their lives depended on it. Because they had. Outside, the bomber's engine stirred. A test pilot climbed in. The runway shimmered with heat. And then, without ceremony, the last bird took flight, its silhouette banking wide over the treetops, lifting into the Michigan sky on wings forged not by warriors, but by workers. The shift clock ticked to 8. And that was it. No parade, just another shift change, another war behind them, an empire behind them, dismantled by tools, by hours, by hands. Across the Atlantic, what remained of the Nazi regime was a ghost of its former grandeur. The once proud bunkers were hollow and cracked. Ammunition stores were looted or left to rust. The marble steps of the Reich Chancellery were blackened by smoke and trampled by boots that didn't belong to Germans. The Third Reich, which had once seemed indestructible, with its torchlit rallies, its mechanized divisions, its myth of superiority, had been undone not by ideology, but by production, by mass, by scale, by the unrelenting hum of 1,000 American plants that never stopped, never hesitated, and never bowed to tyranny. It's tempting to say the war was won on the beaches, in the skies, in the foxholes, and it was. But the deeper truth, the harder, quieter truth, is that it was won before the first boots hit Normandy, before the first Sherman tank rolled through Sicily, before the first paratrooper dropped behind enemy lines in the dark. It was won on factory floors where sun rarely touched steel, where farmers became welders and clerks became crane operators, where immigrants learned to read blueprints in a language they barely spoke, where African-American workers in segregated Detroit stood shoulder to shoulder with white colleagues under a shared oath. Get it built, get it out, get it there. It was won in freight yards and ship slips and switchboard rooms where logistics moved faster than bullets. And it was won in the belief, stubborn and uniquely American, that free people, given purpose and tools, could outbuild any empire. From the Ruhr to the Alps, from the Ardennes to Berlin, the story repeated itself. German troops surrendering not just to infantry, but to the impossibility of resistance. You can fight an army. You can hold a line. But how do you fight a system that replaces every loss before the sun sets? How do you resist a force that builds tanks faster than you can destroy them, and still has enough steel left over to make toasters? That's what broke the Reich, not just bombs, but the realization that its enemy wasn't simply fighting a war. It was manufacturing one. At the height of production, America wasn't just making weapons. It was making certainty. Every bolt tightened on a B-17 was a promise to a pilot not yet born. Every Jeep boxed and shipped overseas was a silent assurance to a rifleman that he wouldn't walk alone. Every crate of rations, every gallon of fuel, every stitched parachute was a vote of confidence from the home front to the front line. You are not forgotten. No empire built on conquest can survive that kind of faith. Not when it comes stamped into aluminum every 60 minutes. In a warehouse outside Munich, after the surrender, a German general walked alone down a corridor lined with captured American supply crates. Each was marked not with slogans, but with numbers, dates, weights, serial codes. It was all so impersonal, so mechanical. He paused at one crate of replacement tail fins for a Mustang squadron. A note was taped to the inside lid. Just one line, written in pencil. Get 'em home safe. He stood there for a long time, then, gently, closed the lid. By August 1945, the machines began to fall quiet. Welders returned to farms. Rosie the riveter took off her gloves and returned to the kitchen, or sometimes didn't. The war was over, but the message remained. America had proved that free men and women, when given a goal and the means to reach it, could build not only faster than dictatorships, but better, because they didn't build for fear. They built for return, for homecomings, for peace. Willow Run, once a beating heart of aviation steel, emptied slowly, one hangar at a time. The lights flickered off. The tracks grew dusty. A bird nested in the rafters where bombers once hung. But outside, in the open sky, the legacy remained. A lone B-24 circles overhead, the last of its line. Its wings catch the sunset. Orange gold reflecting off riveted skin. Beneath it, the fields are quiet. And beneath that, the Reich lies still, crushed not by hatred, but by hours on a clock, by swing shifts, by second lunches and overtime and midnight rail cars, by a free nation humming to life at 6 a.m. and clocking out at dusk, with the world forever changed. Not because totalitarianism may build statues, but only liberty builds engines.